December 23, 1944, the Ardennes forest, Belgium. The snow fell in thick, silent curtains covering the blood and the mud and the shattered trees with a false tenderness. Wilhelm Vogel lay in a crater, his left leg twisted beneath him at an angle that made his stomach turn. The pain had evolved beyond screaming. It had become a dull, grinding presence that filled his entire world. Around him the forest breathed with the aftermath of artillery, the crack of splintering wood, the hiss of snow meeting hot metal, the distant groans of other wounded men whose voices grew fainter with each passing hour. 23 years old, a machine gunner from Dusseldorf. And now this, waiting for death in a frozen Belgian forest while his leg turned the color of spoiled meat. Wilhelm pressed his face against the snow, letting the cold numb his cheek, and thought of the stories they'd told him since he was a boy in short pants, listening to his uncle's tales from the Great War. The Americans show no mercy. They bayonet the wounded. They laugh as they do it. If you are captured, you are already dead. Better to save the last bullet for yourself. The propaganda films in the Hitler Youth had reinforced it, week after week. Images of savage enemies, subhuman beasts in Allied uniforms, waiting to torture and humiliate good German soldiers. And now, as boots crunched through the snow somewhere to his left, Wilhelm Vogel prepared himself for the end he'd been promised. To understand what happened next, to comprehend the magnitude of Wilhelm Vogel's transformation, we must first understand who he was before the fragment tore through his leg, before the infection set in, before everything he believed about the world unraveled in a Red Cross hospital bed. Wilhelm had been born in 1921, in the chaotic aftermath of Germany's first defeat. His earliest memories were of hunger, not the dramatic starvation of wartime propaganda, but the grinding daily hunger of Weimar inflation, when his mother spent an entire wheelbarrow of worthless marks on a single loaf of bread. His father, a metal worker, had died in 1923, crushed between machines in a factory accident that left the family with nothing but debts and the bitter taste of injustice. The Hitler Youth had saved him, or so he believed. They gave him structure, purpose, belonging. They fed him when his mother couldn't. They taught him that Germany's suffering had a cause, external enemies, internal traitors, a world conspiracy to keep the German people on their knees. And they taught him, most importantly, that redemption would come through strength, through steel, through the willingness to sacrifice everything for the Volk. By 1941, when he was 20 years old, Wilhelm Vogel had become exactly what the regime needed, a true believer. He'd mastered the MG-42 machine gun, could strip and reassemble it blindfolded, could fire 600 rounds per minute with precision that earned him commendations. He'd fought in Russia, survived the brutal winter of 1941 and 42, seen things that hollowed him out inside, but never shook his faith that it was all necessary, all part of the great struggle. The Eastern Front had taught him other lessons too. He'd seen how the Wehrmacht treated Soviet prisoners, the casual cruelty, the starvation, the mass executions. He'd heard the stories whispered around campfires of what happened in the camps, in the occupied territories. Though he'd trained himself not to think too deeply about such things, the propaganda had prepared him for that too. The enemy is subhuman. The enemy deserves no mercy. The enemy would do worse to us if given the chance. And now, in December of 1944, transferred to the Western Front for Hitler's desperate gamble in the Ardennes, Wilhelm carried all of this history in his bones. The fear, the indoctrination, the certainty that capture meant torture and death. When his unit had been ordered to hold a position near the village of Chronicle, he'd obeyed without question, setting up his machine gun in a snow-covered foxhole, watching as American forces advanced through the white morning mist. The battle had been brief and brutal. American artillery had found their position with terrifying accuracy. The Americans always had more shells, more ammunition, more of everything. The concussion from the first impact had thrown Wilhelm sideways, and then he'd felt the hot punch of shrapnel tearing through his left thigh. He'd crawled away from the position, dragging himself through the snow as the world exploded around him, until he'd collapsed in the crater where he now lay, watching his legs swell and darken, feeling the fever begin its slow climb through his body. German medics couldn't reach him. The position had been overrun. He was alone in enemy territory, wounded, feverish, and utterly convinced that when the Americans found him, they would finish what the artillery had started. The boot stopped 3 feet from his head. Wilhelm kept his eyes closed, his breathing shallow. He could hear voices speaking in English, harsh, guttural sounds that his fevered mind couldn't parse into meaning. He waited for the rifle shot, the bayonet thrust, the crack of a rifle butt against his skull. Instead, someone knelt beside him. "Hey, buddy, can you hear me?" The voice was young, almost gentle. Wilhelm opened his eyes to see an American soldier, a medic, judging by the Red Cross on his helmet, crouched beside him in the snow. The medic's face showed concern, not hatred. Behind him 2 other soldiers stood guard, weapons ready, but they weren't pointing them at Wilhelm. They were scanning the tree line, protecting the medic while he worked. "Looks bad," the medic said, switching to broken German. "Bein ist schlecht. Leg is bad. We help. Wir helfen." Wilhelm tried to speak, to tell them to just get it over with, but his throat was too dry. The medic was already cutting away his trouser leg, exposing the wound. The smell that emerged made Wilhelm gag, sweet, rotten, the distinctive stench of advanced infection. The flesh around the shrapnel entry was black at the edges, green and yellow pus oozing from the wound. In his delirium, Wilhelm had lost track of time, but the infection suggested he'd been lying here for at least 12 hours, probably longer. The medic whistled low. "Jesus, this needs a surgeon, fast." He looked at Wilhelm with something that might have been pity. "You're lucky we found you, Fritz. Few more hours, and you'd be gone." Lucky. Wilhelm almost laughed, or would have if he'd had the strength. They gave him morphine, actual morphine, not the watered-down substitutes the Wehrmacht had been using for the past year. The warmth spread through his body like a benediction, dulling the agony to a distant, manageable throb. The medic wrapped the wound in clean bandages, white as fresh snow, nothing like the gray, reused rags Wilhelm had seen in German field hospitals. Then they lifted him onto a stretcher, and 2 soldiers carried him through the forest toward the American lines. Wilhelm drifted in and out of consciousness during the journey. Each time he surfaced, he expected to find himself being dragged toward some grim fate, a ditch, a summary execution, the torture chamber from the propaganda films. But each time, he found only the same steady movement, the same careful handling, the same young faces of soldiers who looked as tired and cold as he felt. They reached the American field hospital just as night fell. Wilhelm had a confused impression of canvas tents, bright electric lights, organized chaos. The sounds were different from German field hospitals, less screaming, more calm efficiency. And the smell, instead of the overwhelming stench of gangrene and death that pervaded every German medical facility he'd seen, there was the sharp, clean scent of disinfectant. A doctor appeared, an older man, maybe 40, with gray streaks in his hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a professor. He examined Wilhelm's leg with quick, expert movements, then looked at the young German with an expression Wilhelm couldn't read. "You understand English?" the doctor asked. Wilhelm shook his head weakly. The doctor switched to surprisingly fluent German. "Your leg is badly infected. Without immediate surgery and antibiotics, you'll lose it. Probably die from sepsis within 48 hours. But we can save it. I'm going to have you transferred to our Red Cross hospital. They have the proper facilities, the right medications." He paused, studying Wilhelm's face. "Do you understand what I'm telling you? We're going to save your leg." Wilhelm stared at him, uncomprehending. Save his leg. Impossible. German military doctors amputated at the first sign of serious infection. They had no choice, with limited supplies and overwhelming casualties. The standing joke in the Wehrmacht was that German surgeons knew only one operation: cutting things off. "I don't." Wilhelm's voice cracked. "Why?" The doctor's expression softened. Because that's what doctors do, son. We save lives. Doesn't matter what uniform you're wearing. He nodded to a nurse. Get him prepped for transport, and someone find out if we have any German speakers among the orderlies. I want him to understand everything we're doing. The Red Cross Hospital was located in a requisitioned Belgian schoolhouse, 15 miles behind the front lines. Wilhelm arrived there on the morning of December 24th, Christmas Eve, though he wouldn't realize the significance until later. The journey had been remarkably smooth. A heated ambulance, another dose of morphine, careful handling that seemed almost absurd given that he was, officially, an enemy combatant. His first impression of the hospital was warmth. After weeks of freezing in foxholes and snow-filled craters, the heated interior of the building struck him like a physical blow. The second impression was light, electric lights everywhere, bright enough to read by. Nothing like the dim, flickering oil lamps of German field hospitals. And the third impression, the one that made him wonder if the morphine was causing hallucinations, was cleanliness. The walls were painted white. The floors were scrubbed. The sheets on the beds, actual beds, not straw-filled pallets, were white, crisp, obviously laundered. They put him in a ward with 20 other patients, a mix of American and German wounded. Wilhelm's fevered mind struggled to process this. Enemy soldiers lying in beds next to each other, no guards with bayonets, no segregation, just rows of men in various states of injury, being tended by nurses who moved efficiently from bed to bed without seeming to notice or care about the color of the uniforms hanging on the wall hooks. A German-speaking orderly, a second-generation immigrant from Milwaukee, came to explain what would happen next. "The surgeon will operate this afternoon," he said, his accent marking him as American despite his fluent German. "They'll clean out the infection, remove any dead tissue, and then you'll begin a course of penicillin. Do you know what penicillin is?" Wilhelm shook his head. He'd heard rumors of a miracle drug the Allies had, but German propaganda dismissed it as a lie, another example of enemy deception. "It's an antibiotic," the orderly explained. "Kills bacteria. The infection in your leg, without penicillin, you'd be dead in days. With it, you'll be walking in a few weeks." He grinned. "I know it sounds like magic. First time I saw it work, I didn't believe it either, but you'll see." The surgery happened that afternoon, conducted by a team that included the same doctor who'd examined Wilhelm at the field hospital. They used a proper anesthetic, not the minimal dose the Wehrmacht provided to stretch supplies, but enough to knock Wilhelm completely unconscious. When he woke, groggy and disoriented, his leg was still there, still attached, heavily bandaged, throbbing with a different kind of pain, clean pain, surgical pain, not the rotten agony of infection. A nurse appeared beside his bed. She was young, maybe 25, with auburn hair tucked under her cap and a competent, no-nonsense manner. "Welcome back," she said in English, then switched to slow, careful German. "Wie fühlen Sie sich? How do you feel?" "My leg," Wilhelm managed. "It's still there." "Of course it is." She checked his pulse, made notes on a chart. "Dr. Morrison is one of the best surgeons in the division. He wouldn't amputate unless absolutely necessary." She adjusted his blanket with the same efficient care. "You'll get your first dose of penicillin in an hour, then every 4 hours after that. We'll change your dressing twice daily, and we need to get some food in you. You're severely malnourished." Malnourished. Wilhelm almost laughed again. Of course he was malnourished. Every soldier in the Wehrmacht was malnourished. Rations had been cut again and again as the war dragged on. The joke was that German soldiers fought on empty stomachs and empty promises. What arrived an hour later made Wilhelm certain he was hallucinating. A tray of food, hot soup, actual meat floating in it, not just thin broth. A thick slice of white bread with butter, cooked vegetables, and a piece of chocolate. Real chocolate, not the sawdust and chemicals substitute German civilians had learned to choke down. And coffee. Weak American coffee, but coffee nonetheless, not the acorn grounds concoction the Wehrmacht provided. Wilhelm stared at the tray for a full minute, unable to move. The orderly from Milwaukee noticed his paralysis. "Something wrong." "This is all for me. Well, yeah, standard patient meal. I know it's not much, but the orderly paused, seeing the expression on Wilhelm's face. When's the last time you had a hot meal? Wilhelm tried to remember. Weeks. The Wehrmacht had been on reduced rations since the summer, and combat rations were worse. His unit had been living on hard bread, thin soup, and whatever they could scrounge. I don't remember, he admitted. The orderly's expression changed to something like pity. Jesus. Well, eat up, buddy. And there's more where that came from. Wilhelm ate slowly, reverently, tasting each bite as if it were a sacrament. The meat was tender, seasoned with herbs he couldn't identify. The bread was soft, nothing like the rock-hard Kommissbrot that broke teeth. The chocolate melted on his tongue, sweet and rich, and utterly unlike anything he'd tasted in years. He was crying, he realized, tears running down his face as he chewed, unable to stop even though it embarrassed him. The American in the next bed, a sergeant with both legs in casts, watched him quietly, then looked away, giving him privacy for his breakdown. Over the next 2 weeks, Wilhelm Vogel received an education that no Hitler youth leader, no Wehrmacht officer, no propaganda minister could have prepared him for. It was an education conducted not through speeches or films, but through the daily accumulating evidence of his own eyes. The penicillin arrived every 4 hours, administered by nurses who treated him with professional courtesy. They explained what the medication was doing, how it fought the infection, why he might feel various side effects. They spoke to him as if he were a person, not a number or an enemy. When he asked questions, they answered. When he struggled with English medical terms, they found someone to translate. When he woke at night, panicking from fever dreams of being tortured, a nurse would sit beside his bed and talk him calm again in quiet, accented German. The wound care was meticulous. Twice daily, nurses would remove his bandages, clean the surgical site with gentle efficiency, apply fresh dressings. Wilhelm watched the wound transform, the angry red inflammation fading to pink, the swelling diminishing, healthy tissue beginning to grow. In German field hospitals, wounds like his invariably turned gangrenous. Here it simply healed. The food kept coming. 3 meals a day, every day, each one more abundant than anything he'd seen since before the war. Fresh fruit, apples, oranges, things he'd only dreamed about. Meat at almost every meal. Milk, real milk, not the thin blue stuff German civilians called milk. Coffee and sugar. Bread with jam. Once, impossibly, ice cream. Wilhelm watched the other prisoners eating with the same stunned reverence he felt. A 17-year-old from Bavaria broke down crying over a bowl of chicken soup. A veteran tank commander from Prussia stared at his orange for 5 full minutes before carefully peeling it as if handling a religious artifact. They'd all been told the same lies about American supply shortages, about the Allies struggling to feed themselves. The evidence of their eyes demolished those lies with every meal. But it wasn't just the medical care or the food that shattered Wilhelm's worldview. It was the attitude, the approach, the fundamental assumption underlying every interaction. The American doctors and nurses treated German prisoners exactly as they treated American soldiers. There was no hierarchy of care, no distinction between friend and enemy. If you were wounded, you received treatment. If you were in pain, you received morphine. If you were hungry, you received food. If you were frightened, someone sat with you until the fear passed. Wilhelm tried to make sense of it. He'd been taught that Americans were motivated by racial hatred, by a desire to destroy Germany and enslave the German people. But the young medic who'd found him in the snow had shown concern, not hatred. The surgeon who'd saved his leg had worked with the same care he'd give an American patient. The nurses who tended him daily never showed contempt or cruelty. He tried to dismiss it as propaganda. The Americans were simply being nice to prisoners to encourage surrender, to weaken German morale. But that theory collapsed under the weight of accumulated evidence. The care was too consistent, too genuine, too universal. Every staff member, from surgeons to orderlies, exhibited the same fundamental respect for human life and dignity. On the third day, Wilhelm witnessed something that would stay with him forever. An American soldier was brought in, badly wounded by German artillery. He was screaming, delirious with pain and shock. The medical team descended on him with controlled urgency. Dr. Morrison himself supervised the triage. Nurses moved with practiced efficiency. Orderlies prepared the operating theater. They stabilized him, got him into surgery, spent 2 hours saving his life. 4 hours later, a German prisoner was brought in with similar wounds. Wilhelm watched, tense, wondering if this would be different, if the Americans would provide lesser care to an enemy soldier, if their humanity extended only so far. Dr. Morrison took one look at the wounded German, called out the same urgent instructions, supervised the same controlled chaos of emergency medicine. The surgery lasted 3 hours. The German survived. And when Wilhelm asked the Milwaukee orderly if this was normal, the orderly looked puzzled. Of course it's normal. Why wouldn't it be? They're both wounded. They both need help. He paused, studying Wilhelm's face. Did you think we'd let him die because he's German? Wilhelm had thought exactly that, because that's what German military doctrine taught. Resources were limited. German soldiers came first. Everyone else was expendable. In the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm said slowly, we were taught to save Germans first, always. If supplies are limited, if there's a choice between a German soldier and... He trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. The orderly's expression hardened. That's the difference between us and you, he said quietly. We don't make those choices. A wounded man is a wounded man, period. Understanding Wilhelm Vogel's mental transformation requires understanding how deeply the Nazi indoctrination had penetrated. This wasn't simply a matter of believing political propaganda or accepting wartime necessity. The Hitler Youth, the Wehrmacht training, the constant reinforcement from every authority figure in his life, all of it had built a comprehensive worldview in which certain fundamental truths were self-evident. Truth 1, Germans were superior, facing a worldwide conspiracy of inferior races determined to destroy them. Truth 2, the enemy was subhuman, incapable of mercy or civilization, deserving only of destruction. Truth 3, any show of weakness or compassion was a betrayal of the Volk, a surrender that would lead to Germany's annihilation. These weren't casual beliefs Wilhelm could easily discard. They were the foundation of his identity, the lens through which he interpreted every experience. Abandoning them meant admitting that everything he'd fought for, everything he'd witnessed and participated in on the Eastern Front, had been based on lies. The human mind resists such realizations with every defense mechanism available. For the first few days in the hospital, Wilhelm's brain worked overtime to rationalize what he was experiencing. The Americans were making a special effort for propaganda purposes. This hospital was an exception, not the rule. The care would deteriorate once the initial show was over. He was simply lucky to have fallen into the hands of an unusually compassionate unit. But the evidence kept accumulating, relentless and undeniable. On the 5th day, Wilhelm witnessed an argument between an American doctor and a nurse. A German prisoner had developed complications. His wound was healing slower than expected, and he needed additional treatment. The hospital was under pressure to free up beds for incoming casualties from the ongoing Ardennes offensive. The nurse suggested transferring the German to a less equipped facility to make room. Dr. Morrison's response was immediate and forceful. Absolutely not. This patient needs specialized care, and he'll receive it here until he's stable. I don't care if he's German, Russian, or Martian. We don't dump patients based on nationality. The nurse accepted the reprimand without argument. The German stayed. And Wilhelm, listening from his bed, felt something crack inside his carefully constructed defenses. They weren't pretending. This wasn't propaganda. The care, the respect, the fundamental commitment to treating all wounded equally. It was real. It was policy. It was the foundation of how the American medical system operated. On the 7th day, Wilhelm had a conversation with another German prisoner, a sergeant named Klaus Weber from Hamburg. Weber had been captured 3 weeks earlier, long enough to have processed his own transformation. They spoke in low voices after lights out, comparing notes on their experiences. I fought in Poland, Weber said quietly. Saw what we did there. Told myself it was necessary, that the Poles were subhuman anyway, that we were just securing Lebensraum for the German people. He was silent for a moment. Then I got captured, and the Americans treated me like a human being, fed me, fixed my broken arm, spoke to me with respect. His voice dropped to barely a whisper. Do you know what that means? It means everything we were told was backwards. We were the monsters, not them. Wilhelm lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of that realization settle over him like a burial shroud. Every propaganda film, every speech, every newspaper article, every Hitler Youth lesson, all lies. Not exaggerations or partial truths, but complete inversions of reality. The Americans, who were supposed to be barbaric and uncivilized, had built a medical system that treated enemies with dignity. The Germans, who claimed to be the bearers of civilization, had built concentration camps and murder factories. The enemy he'd been taught to hate and fear had saved his life and his leg. The nation he'd been raised to serve had sent him to die in a frozen forest for a war that was already lost. The psychological pain of this realization was worse than the physical pain of his wound. Wilhelm found himself retreating into silence, processing the enormity of his awakening. The nurses noticed, asked if he was in pain, offered morphine. He couldn't explain that the pain was in his soul, that every certainty he'd ever held was dissolving, that he was watching his entire identity crumble. But life in the hospital continued, and the daily accumulation of small kindnesses gradually built something new in the ruins of Wilhelm's shattered worldview. The nurses learned his name, not the German in bed 12, but Wilhelm. They asked about his family, his home, his life before the war. When he mentioned his mother, a nurse named Sarah brought him paper and pencil, encouraged him to write a letter. "We'll see it gets to the Red Cross," she said. "They have systems for getting mail to families, even across the lines." The thought that his mother might learn he was alive, that he wasn't dead in some Belgian forest, brought tears to his eyes again. He'd cried more in this hospital than in the previous 5 years of war. But these tears were different. Not tears of pain or fear, but of something he couldn't quite name. Relief. Gratitude. The slow, painful thawing of a frozen heart. The food continued to astonish him. On Christmas Day, a holiday the Americans celebrated with enthusiastic sincerity, the hospital served a feast that would have been impressive in peacetime Germany. Turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, 3 kinds of vegetables, fresh bread, and pie. Actual pie, made with real fruit and sugar. The staff had decorated the ward with paper chains and hung a small Christmas tree in the corner. Wilhelm watched American soldiers and German prisoners celebrating together, sharing food, trading cigarettes, attempting conversations in broken English and German. The absurdity of it struck him forcefully. Men who'd been trying to kill each other weeks ago, now passing dishes and laughing at language misunderstandings. An American lieutenant with a bandaged shoulder sat on the edge of Wilhelm's bed, offering a cigarette. Wilhelm accepted, noting how the American's hands were scarred from combat, probably from the same battle where Wilhelm had been wounded. "Merry Christmas," the lieutenant said in careful German. "Hope you're healing up okay." "Thank you," Wilhelm managed. "Your doctors." "They saved my leg." The lieutenant nodded. "Morrison's the best. He'll get you fixed up." He took a drag from his own cigarette, studying Wilhelm with an expression that wasn't quite friendly, but wasn't hostile either. "You got family back home?" "My mother. In Düsseldorf." "Düsseldorf got hit pretty hard by the bombing, I heard. I hope she's okay." The casual compassion in that statement, concern for the family of an enemy soldier, struck Wilhelm with the force of revelation. This American, who'd been fighting Germans for months, who'd been wounded by German weapons, still had room in his heart for sympathy toward a German mother he'd never meet. "Thank you," Wilhelm said again, inadequately. The lieutenant stubbed out his cigarette. "Look, I'm not going to pretend we're friends or anything. You were shooting at us. We were shooting at you. That's how war works. But this," he gestured around the ward, "this is different. In here, we're all just guys trying to survive." He stood, wincing slightly at the movement. "Anyway, Merry Christmas. Hope you get home to your mom soon." The daily routine of wound care became Wilhelm's education in contrasts. Every time the nurses changed his dressing, he was forced to confront the difference between what he'd experienced in German medical facilities and what he was experiencing here. In German field hospitals, morphine was carefully rationed. You got enough to keep you from screaming, not enough to actually ease the pain. Here, when Wilhelm indicated discomfort before dressing changes, they gave him adequate pain medication, every time. In German facilities, bandages were reused, washed and rewashed until they were gray and threadbare. Here, every dressing was fresh, white, sterile. The hospital seemed to have an inexhaustible supply. In German facilities, wound infections were expected, inevitable. Here, between the penicillin treatments and the meticulous sterile technique, infections were rare, treatable, not death sentences. The difference wasn't just medical, it was philosophical. German military medicine operated on scarcity, on triage that valued some lives over others, on the assumption that casualties were acceptable losses in service of the larger war effort. American military medicine operated on abundance, on the principle that every life was worth saving, on systems designed to minimize death rather than simply manage it. Wilhelm saw this philosophy in action repeatedly. An American private developed pneumonia. Within hours, he was receiving intensive care, multiple medications, constant monitoring. A German prisoner showed signs of sepsis. The response was identical. No discussion of relative worth, no calculation of resource allocation, just immediate, comprehensive treatment. The efficiency was startling. The hospital had systems for everything: medication schedules, wound care protocols, dietary requirements, physical therapy. Charts were maintained with meticulous detail. Staff rotated on predictable schedules, ensuring continuity of care. Nothing was left to chance or individual discretion. Wilhelm mentioned this to Klaus Weber during one of their evening conversations. "The organization," he said wonderingly. "Everything has a system, a procedure. Nothing is improvised." Weber laughed bitterly. "Because they have the resources to build systems. We've been improvising for years because we don't have supplies, don't have personnel, don't have anything but empty promises from Berlin." He paused. "You know what the real difference is. They actually care if we live or die. The Wehrmacht. We're just numbers. Replaceable meat for the grinder." It was a harsh truth, but Wilhelm couldn't deny it. He'd seen how German officers treated soldiers as expendable resources, units to be sacrificed for tactical advantage. The language itself revealed the mindset. Soldiers didn't die, they fell. They weren't killed, they made sacrifices. The dehumanizing vocabulary made it easier to accept massive casualties as simply the cost of war. Here, soldiers were individuals. Every death was mourned, every life preserved when possible. The staff knew patients' names, their stories, their fears. They treated Wilhelm not as enemy prisoner of war 147B, but as Wilhelm Vogel, a 23-year-old from Düsseldorf who missed his mother and was terrified his leg wouldn't heal properly. On January 5, 1945, 13 days after his surgery, Wilhelm Vogel took his first steps. The physical therapist was a burly corporal from Montana named Jack, who approached rehabilitation with good-humored determination. "All right, Wilhelm," he said in his slow, careful German. "Time to see if Dr. Morrison's handiwork holds up. Ready to try standing?" Wilhelm wasn't ready. He was terrified. The leg still hurt, still felt weak and unreliable. What if it collapsed? What if the wound reopened? What if the infection came back? Jack seemed to read his thoughts. "I'll be right here. We're just going to stand, put a little weight on it, see how it feels. Nothing dramatic." They started slowly. Wilhelm swung his legs over the side of the bed, feet touching the floor for the first time in 2 weeks. The left foot was swollen, sensitive, but it responded to his commands. Jack gripped his arms, providing support as Wilhelm pushed himself upright. The room swayed. Wilhelm's right leg took most of his weight, but the left leg was there, bearing load, functioning. Not perfectly. It would be weeks before he could walk normally. But it was working. The joint moved. The muscles responded. The wound held. Wilhelm laughed suddenly, a sound that surprised him with its intensity. He was standing, on two legs, both his legs. The leg that should have been amputated, that would have been amputated in any German hospital, was supporting his weight and healing. "How's it feel?" Jack asked, grinning. "Like a miracle," Wilhelm said honestly. They worked for 20 minutes, just standing, shifting weight, taking tiny, shuffling steps. By the end, Wilhelm was exhausted, sweating, and triumphant. Jack helped him back to bed, clearly pleased with the progress. "You'll be walking properly in a few weeks," Jack predicted. "Dancing by spring." Well, maybe not dancing, but definitely walking. Morrison did a hell of a job. After Jack left, Wilhelm lay in bed, staring at his legs. Both of them, still attached, still functional. Saved by the enemy he'd been taught to hate. The enormity of the gift hit him fully for the first time. The Americans hadn't just saved his life, they'd saved his future. A one-legged man in defeated Germany would be a burden, unemployable, dependent on charity that wouldn't exist in the ruins of the Reich. With both legs he could work, could rebuild, could have a life beyond the war. They'd given him that. The enemy, the subhuman monsters of Nazi propaganda. They'd given him a future when his own nation had written him off as expendable. But with understanding came guilt, a crushing, suffocating guilt that grew heavier each day. Wilhelm had fought in Russia. He'd been there during the terrible winter of 1941, seen the columns of Soviet prisoners marching toward camps from which few would emerge. He'd witnessed executions, casual violence, the systematic starvation of entire populations. He'd told himself it was necessary, that the Russians were Bolshevik animals, that Germany needed the territory to survive. Now, lying in an American hospital bed, receiving care and compassion from people he'd been trying to kill, Wilhelm was forced to confront what he'd participated in. The contrast was unbearable. If the Americans could treat German prisoners with such humanity, what did that say about how Germans had treated their prisoners? The answer was clear, inescapable, devastating. Klaus Weber struggled with the same guilt. Late one night, he confessed to Wilhelm what he'd seen in Poland. "There was a village," he whispered. "We were ordered to clear it. The officers said partisans were hiding there, but there weren't any partisans, just civilians, just people." He stopped, unable to continue. Wilhelm understood. He'd seen similar things, participated in similar actions. He'd followed orders, told himself he had no choice, that questioning was treason. But the Americans had taught him that there were always choices. Every nurse who showed kindness, every doctor who provided excellent care, every orderly who treated prisoners with respect, they were all making choices to be decent human beings, despite the war, despite having every justification for hatred. The weight of his complicity became almost unbearable. Wilhelm found himself unable to meet the eyes of the American staff, certain they must know, must see what he'd done, must recognize him for what he was, not a victim of Nazi propaganda, but a willing participant in atrocity. One afternoon, Dr. Morrison sat on the edge of Wilhelm's bed, reviewing his chart. The doctor seemed to sense Wilhelm's inner turmoil. "Something bothering you?" Morrison asked in his fluent German. "Besides the obvious, I mean. You've been getting quieter." Wilhelm couldn't answer. How could he explain that every act of kindness was a knife in his conscience, that every meal was a reminder of Soviet prisoners starved deliberately, that every gentle word echoed with the screams he'd ignored? Morrison studied him quietly. "You know," he said finally, "I've been doing this for 2 years now, treating wounded from both sides. And I've learned something about guilt." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Every German soldier who comes through here eventually realizes what his country has done, what he may have been part of, and that realization, it's painful. Sometimes more painful than the physical wounds. Wilhelm stared at him, stunned that the doctor understood. "I can't absolve you," Morrison continued gently. "That's not my job, and I don't know what you've done or seen. But I can tell you this. Recognizing the truth, feeling the weight of it, that's the first step toward being better, toward making different choices." He stood, adjusting his stethoscope. "The war will end eventually. What matters is what kind of man walks out of here when it does." The conversation stayed with Wilhelm for days. What kind of man would he be? Could he be? The old Wilhelm Vogel, the true believer, the machine gunner who'd followed orders without question. That person was dead, killed not by American bullets, but by American compassion. In his place was someone new, uncertain, haunted by the past, but no longer able to deny it. As January progressed and Wilhelm's mobility improved, he began to move around the ward more freely. Physical therapy sessions became longer, more ambitious. He progressed from shuffling steps to actual walking, from needing constant support to managing with a cane. The leg was healing remarkably well, the infection completely gone, the tissue regenerating, strength gradually returning. This increased mobility gave Wilhelm new perspectives on the hospital's social dynamics. The ward had developed its own culture, a strange hybrid community of enemies forced into proximity by shared vulnerability. American soldiers and German prisoners played cards together, using gestures and broken language to communicate. They traded cigarettes, shared photos of families back home, complained about hospital food. The Germans complained quietly, still amazed they were complaining about abundance rather than scarcity. Friendships formed, tentative, conditional, but real. Wilhelm watched a young American corporal teaching basic English to a German private, barely 18 years old. "This is thank you," the American said slowly. "Repeat. Thank you." "Sank you," the German attempted, mangling the pronunciation. Close enough. The American laughed, friendly and encouraging. This casual interaction, enemies becoming, if not friends, then at least something more human than the other, represented everything the Nazi ideology had denied. Germans and Americans weren't natural enemies, weren't fundamentally incompatible. They were just men, caught in a war neither had started, discovering their shared humanity in the neutral territory of a hospital ward. Wilhelm became particularly close with an American sergeant named Robert Hayes from Ohio. Hayes had lost 3 fingers to frostbite during the Battle of the Bulge and was waiting for medical discharge. He'd learned German from his grandmother, who'd emigrated in 1922, and he approached Wilhelm one day with a chess set. "You play?" Hayes asked. Wilhelm nodded. Chess had been popular in the Hitler Youth, promoted as a game that developed strategic thinking. They began playing daily. During their games, they talked, cautiously at first, then with growing frankness. Hayes told stories of his hometown, his wife, his dreams of opening a hardware store after the war. Wilhelm spoke of Dusseldorf, his mother, his dead father, his confusion about what came next. "What'll you do?" Hayes asked one day, studying the chessboard. "After the war, I mean. When you go home." Wilhelm had been thinking about this constantly. "I don't know if there's a home to go back to. Dusseldorf, the bombing." He moved his knight, a defensive play. "And even if there is, I don't know who I'll be there. I can't go back to who I was." Hayes nodded slowly. "Nobody comes back from war the same. That's what my dad said after the last war. He was in France, came home different. He captured Wilhelm's pawn. But different doesn't have to be bad. Maybe you'll be different in a good way. You seem like a decent guy." "How can you say that?" Wilhelm burst out. "I'm German, Wehrmacht. I've done—" He stopped, unable to continue. Hayes looked at him steadily. "Yeah, you're German. Yeah, you fought for a terrible regime. But sitting here, right now, talking to me, you're just a guy who got shot, got saved, and is trying to figure things out." He paused. "The war made you do things. Fine. But the war doesn't get to decide who you become after." It was the same message Dr. Morrison had conveyed, but hearing it from a fellow soldier, someone who'd been on the other side, who had every reason to hate Germans, made it penetrate deeper. In mid-January, Nurse Sarah approached Wilhelm with an envelope. "The Red Cross got your letter through," she said, smiling, "and this came back. From your mother." Wilhelm stared at the envelope, his mother's familiar handwriting making his eyes blur. He'd written to her 3 weeks ago, hardly daring to hope the letter would arrive, that she'd be alive to receive it, that she'd be able to respond. He waited until evening, until the ward was quiet, before opening it. His hands shook as he unfolded the thin paper. "My dearest Wilhelm, I cannot express the joy I felt receiving your letter, learning you are alive. We received notice in November that you were missing in action, and I have spent every day since praying for a miracle. God has answered my prayers. Dusseldorf is much changed since you left. The bombing has destroyed much of the city. Our apartment building still stands miraculously, though the roof is damaged, and we live in fear of each air raid. Food is scarce, heat scarcer. But we survive. Your letter says you are being treated well by the Americans, that your leg is healing. I am grateful beyond words. I know the propaganda said terrible things about the enemy, but a mother's heart knows that kindness exists everywhere. The Americans who saved you are proof of God's mercy working through human hands. I pray daily for your safe return, for this war to end, for a chance to hold you again. Whatever happens, know that you are loved, that you have a home, that your mother waits for you. Be strong, my son. Be good. Come home when you can." Your loving mother, Wilhelm, read the letter 3 times, memorizing every word. His mother's faith, her simple acceptance that the Americans could be kind, her focus on love rather than politics, it all felt like a lifeline thrown across the abyss of his confusion. She knew the truth the propaganda had denied. Kindness existed everywhere. The enemy could show mercy. Human decency transcended national boundaries. Klaus Weber, in the next bed, noticed Wilhelm's tears. "Good news or bad?" "Good," Wilhelm managed. "My mother's alive. She got my letter." "That's wonderful." Weber smiled, genuine pleasure in his expression. "Hold on to that. Hold on to having something to go home to." Wilhelm folded the letter carefully, tucking it into the small box of personal effects the hospital provided. He would read it again and again in the weeks to come, each reading reinforcing the same lesson. There was life beyond war, love beyond hate, hope beyond the ruins of belief. By late January, Wilhelm could walk the length of the ward without assistance, though he still used the cane and tired easily. The wound had healed to an angry pink scar, still tender but functional. Dr. Morrison pronounced himself satisfied with the progress. "You'll have a limp," he told Wilhelm during a final examination. "Probably for life. But the leg is sound. No infection, good circulation, full range of motion. All things considered, you're lucky to be walking at all." Lucky. That word again. Wilhelm had come to understand it differently now. Lucky not just to be alive, but to have fallen into the hands of people who valued life. Lucky to have received care that most German soldiers would never see. Lucky to have survived long enough for the propaganda to shatter against the hard rock of reality. "When will I be transferred?" Wilhelm asked. He knew the system. Recovering prisoners were eventually moved to POW camps, where they'd wait out the war's end. "Probably next week," Morrison replied. "You're well enough for transport." "The camp you're going to is in France. Conditions are decent. Red Cross inspects regularly. You'll be fine." He paused. "Better than fine, actually. You'll be alive, which is more than a lot of soldiers on both sides can say." The prospect of leaving filled Wilhelm with conflicting emotions. Relief at being away from the front lines, away from combat. Anxiety about the unknown conditions of the POW camp. And, surprisingly, sadness at leaving this place where he'd been transformed. On his last evening in the hospital, several people came to say goodbye. Nurse Sarah gave him extra bandages and antiseptic, explaining how to care for the wound as it finished healing. Jack, the physical therapist, demonstrated exercises to maintain leg strength. The Milwaukee orderly slipped him a pack of cigarettes and a chocolate bar, luxuries for the journey ahead. Robert Hayes found him after dinner, carrying the chess set. "Thought you might want this," he said, offering it. "For the camp. Give you something to do." Wilhelm tried to refuse. It was Hayes's set, after all, but the American insisted. "I'm going home in a week anyway. You need it more than I do." He extended his three-fingered hand for a shake. "Take care of yourself, Wilhelm. Maybe after this is all over, you can write to me. Tell me how things turned out." They exchanged addresses, both knowing the letters might never be written, might never arrive, that the post-war world would be chaotic and broken, but the gesture mattered. The acknowledgement that they'd become something like friends despite everything. Dr. Morrison came by last, carrying Wilhelm's medical file. "This goes with you," he explained. "Complete record of your treatment, the surgery, the medications. If you have any problems, any complications, show this to the camp doctors. They'll know what to do." "Dr. Morrison," Wilhelm said, struggling to find adequate words, "what you did, saving my leg, treating me like a person. I don't know how to—" Morrison cut him off gently. "You don't need to thank me. I'm a doctor. I did my job." He smiled slightly. "But if you really want to thank me, then do something for me. When this war is over, when you go home, remember what you learned here. Remember that the people you were taught to hate are just people, flawed, complicated, but people, and build something better with that knowledge." "I will," Wilhelm promised. "I swear it." January 27th, 1945. 5 weeks after American soldiers had found him in a frozen crater, Wilhelm Vogel walked, limping but walking, to the transport truck that would take him to the POW camp. His leg ached with every step, but it was there, functioning, whole. The penicillin had done its work. The surgery had held. The care had been sufficient. He was alive, and more than alive. He was capable of building a future. The journey to the POW camp took 2 days, but Wilhelm barely noticed the discomfort. He was thinking about everything that had happened, trying to process the magnitude of his transformation. The man who'd lain in that crater expecting death had been a true believer in the Nazi cause, convinced of German superiority and Allied monstrosity. The man boarding this truck was someone different, someone who'd seen the fundamental lie of fascism exposed through acts of simple human decency. The POW camp was, as Morrison had predicted, tolerable, not comfortable. It was still a prison, still confinement, but humane. Regular meals, adequate shelter, medical care when needed. Red Cross inspections ensured decent conditions. Wilhelm settled into the routine of captivity, attending English classes, working in the camp garden, playing chess with other prisoners, waiting for the war to end. News from the front trickled in through official bulletins and smuggled newspapers. The Ardennes offensive had failed completely. Hitler's last gamble had squandered Germany's remaining reserves for no gain. Allied forces were crossing the Rhine. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. The war everyone could see was lost, dragged on anyway, driven by a regime that would rather see Germany destroyed than admit defeat. Wilhelm followed the news with a strange detachment. He'd stopped believing in German victory months ago, lying in that hospital bed. Now he simply hoped for a swift end, for minimal casualties, for some kind of survivable future. He wrote letters to his mother when paper was available. To Robert Hayes, though he never received a response. Hayes had been discharged, returned to Ohio, moved on with his life. To Dr. Morrison, a letter of gratitude that Wilhelm doubted ever arrived but needed to write anyway. And he thought. Constantly, obsessively, he replayed his experience in that hospital, examining it from every angle, extracting lessons, trying to understand what it meant. The central revelation, the truth he kept returning to, was simple and shattering. Everything depended on choice. The Americans had chosen to treat prisoners humanely, not because they had to, not because it was militarily advantageous, but because they'd built systems and trained people to value human life, regardless of nationality. The Nazis had chosen the opposite, had built systems that dehumanized, starved, murdered, all in service of an ideology that reduced people to categories of worthy and worthless. Individuals made choices within those systems. The medic who'd found Wilhelm could have walked past, could have delivered a mercy shot, could have simply left him to die. He chose to help. Dr. Morrison could have amputated, taken the easy route, saved resources. He chose to save the leg. Every nurse, every orderly, every staff member who'd treated Wilhelm with dignity, they'd all made choices to be decent human beings. Wilhelm had made choices too. On the Eastern Front, following orders, he'd chosen not to question, not to resist, not to see. Those choices haunted him now. He couldn't undo them, couldn't erase them, could only acknowledge them and choose differently going forward. May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The war was over. The news reached the POW camp through official announcements and the sudden change in the guards' demeanor. Celebration mixed with relief that the killing had finally stopped. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left Europe in ruins. Wilhelm stood in the camp yard, listening to the announcement in numb silence. Around him, other prisoners reacted with various emotions: relief, despair, shame, confusion. The die-hard Nazis muttered about betrayal, about treacherous generals, about the stab-in-the-back myth already forming. The rest simply looked exhausted, grateful it was over, terrified about what came next. Wilhelm felt nothing but a hollow certainty. This was what he'd expected, had known was coming for months. Germany had lost catastrophically, and now would face the consequences of everything the Nazi regime had done. The repatriation process began slowly. Germany was divided into occupation zones. Prisoners were screened, investigated for war crimes, gradually released to return to the ruins of their homeland. Wilhelm's turn came in late June. He passed the screening, a machine gunner from a standard Wehrmacht unit, no evidence of participation in atrocities beyond the general horror of the Eastern Front. They gave him discharge papers, a set of civilian clothes. His Wehrmacht uniform was taken and burned, and transportation to the American zone of occupation. From there, he would have to make his own way to Düsseldorf. Before leaving the camp, Wilhelm sought out the camp commander, an American major who'd run the facility with firm but fair management. Wilhelm had practiced what he wanted to say for days. "Sir," he said in his broken English, "I want to thank you for the treatment here, for the—" He struggled for words. "For showing us there is another way to be." The major studied him for a moment. "You were in that hospital near the Ardennes, right? Morrison's unit." Wilhelm nodded, surprised the major knew. "Morrison's a good man. Saved a lot of lives, both sides." The major paused. "I hope you remember what you learned there. Germany's going to need men who understand that might isn't right, that violence isn't strength, that treating people decently isn't weakness." He extended his hand. "Good luck, son. Build something better." Wilhelm shook his hand, the gesture carrying weight beyond courtesy. It was an acknowledgment, a passing of responsibility, a challenge to become the person his experiences had prepared him to be. The journey from the POW camp to Düsseldorf took 3 weeks, hitching rides on military transports, walking when necessary, navigating through a Germany that barely resembled the country he'd left. Cities were rubble. Infrastructure was destroyed. Millions of refugees crowded the roads, displaced persons searching for lost families, survivors emerging from hiding, former soldiers trying to find their way home. Wilhelm's leg ached constantly during the journey, but it held up. The American surgery, the penicillin, the care, it had all been sufficient. He walked with a pronounced limp, would for the rest of his life, but he walked. That miracle sustained him through the exhaustion and despair of traveling through a defeated nation. Düsseldorf was almost unrecognizable. The bombing had devastated entire neighborhoods. His childhood street was rubble. But his mother's apartment building miraculously still stood, damaged, windows blown out, but standing. He climbed the familiar stairs, his leg protesting every step, and knocked on the door he'd left nearly 3 years ago. His mother opened it, saw him standing there, and collapsed into his arms, sobbing. She was thinner than he remembered, gray-haired, aged by hardship, but alive. They held each other in the doorway, saying nothing because no words were adequate for the reunion, for the shared relief of survival, for the simple joy of being together again after everything. Inside the damaged apartment, over weak ersatz coffee and the meager rations his mother had hoarded, Wilhelm told her everything. The wounding, the capture, the hospital, the transformation. She listened without interruption, tears streaming down her face, occasionally touching his leg as if to confirm it was real, was still there. "God works through human hands," she said finally. "The Americans who saved you, they were doing God's work, whether they knew it or not." Wilhelm wasn't sure about God anymore. The war had burned away most of his certainties, religious and otherwise, but he understood what she meant. There was something transcendent in simple human kindness, something that redeemed the horror and revealed the possibility of being better. They talked long into the night about the past, about the uncertain future, about how they would survive in the ruins of Germany. His mother had saved a little money hidden from the authorities. Wilhelm would find work, construction probably, rebuilding the city that had built him. Together they would endure. But enduring wasn't enough. Wilhelm had promised Dr. Morrison that he would remember, would build something better with the knowledge he'd gained. That promise became the foundation of his post-war life. The years after the war were brutal for Germany. Hunger, poverty, occupation, denazification, the weight of revealed atrocities, the collective shame and trauma of a nation confronting what it had done. Wilhelm Vogel lived through it all, working construction jobs, helping rebuild Dusseldorf brick by brick, caring for his aging mother, slowly constructing a new life from the wreckage of the old. But he also did something else. He talked. In the late 1940s and early 1950s, as Germany began the painful process of reckoning with its past, Wilhelm became one of the voices speaking honestly about the war, about the propaganda, about the lies that had led an entire nation into catastrophe. He wasn't a prominent speaker, wasn't famous or influential, just a former soldier willing to tell the truth about what he'd believed and how American compassion had shattered those beliefs. He spoke to youth groups, warning them about the dangers of blind obedience, about how easily ordinary people could be led into serving evil. He spoke to veterans organizations encouraging honest confrontation with what the Wehrmacht had done, refusing the comfortable myths of clean fighting and noble sacrifice. He spoke to church groups about the moral responsibility to question authority, to maintain compassion even toward enemies. His message was simple, grounded in his personal experience. Humanity transcends nationality. The Americans could have let him die, could have amputated his leg, could have treated him with the cruelty he'd been taught to expect. Instead, they'd saved him, not for propaganda, not for advantage, but because their system valued human life and dignity. That choice, repeated by countless individuals in countless moments, represented everything the Nazi ideology had rejected. And it was that choice, Wilhelm argued, that Germans needed to embrace going forward. Not strength through domination, but strength through decency. Not superiority over others, but equality with them. Not hatred of the different, but recognition of shared humanity. He met resistance, of course. Many Germans weren't ready to hear such messages, preferred to see themselves as victims rather than perpetrators, clung to the myths that made their wartime actions seem justified. But gradually, slowly, the message resonated. Germany was changing, building a new identity on the ruins of the old, and voices like Wilhelm's contributed to that transformation. In 1953, Wilhelm received a letter from America. Robert Hayes, the sergeant from Ohio he'd befriended in the hospital, had finally tracked him down through Red Cross records. They began a correspondence that would last decades, letters exchanged across the Atlantic, sharing the progress of their lives, maintaining the connection forged in a hospital ward. Hayes told Wilhelm about his hardware store, his children, his work in local government promoting understanding between communities. Wilhelm wrote about his construction work, about his efforts to speak truth about the war, about his mother's eventual peaceful death in 1958. They wrote as friends, as men who'd transcended the circumstances that should have made them enemies. In 1962, Wilhelm traveled to America, his first trip outside Europe since the war. Hayes invited him to Ohio, introduced him to his family, showed him around his town. Wilhelm met Hayes's children, including a daughter named Sarah, after the nurse who'd cared for him. "I wanted her to be named after someone who represented the best of humanity," Hayes explained. "Someone who showed kindness when she didn't have to." Wilhelm understood. He'd named his own son, born in 1956, Carl Morrison Vogel, after his father and the doctor who'd saved his leg. Names as testimony, as remembrance, as commitment to carrying forward the lessons of the past. Wilhelm Vogel lived until 1998, dying at 77 years old in the rebuilt city of Düsseldorf. His funeral was attended by family, friends, former colleagues, and several younger people he'd spoken to over the years about his wartime experience. Hayes, elderly himself, sent a wreath and a letter read aloud at the service. In his final years, Wilhelm had been interviewed several times by historians documenting the war, by filmmakers creating documentaries, by students writing papers on the transformation of German society. He told his story consistently: the indoctrination, the wounding, the capture, the hospital, the revelation. The physical evidence of that story was still visible. The scar on his left leg, faded but permanent. The pronounced limp that had stayed with him for 53 years. The medical records he'd kept, the discharge papers, the letters from Hayes and Morrison. The doctor had written twice after the war, brief notes checking on Wilhelm's recovery. But the deeper evidence was in how Wilhelm had lived, his refusal to embrace comfortable lies about the past, his commitment to speaking difficult truths, his insistence that Germans had to acknowledge what they'd done before they could move forward, his belief that human decency was always possible, always a choice, always necessary. He told an interviewer in 1995, 3 years before his death, that the single most important moment of his life had occurred in a Red Cross hospital on December 24, 1944, when Dr. Morrison had told him, "We're going to save your leg." Not just the leg, Wilhelm explained. He saved something more fundamental. He saved my capacity to be human, to recognize humanity in others, to understand that we always have choices about how we treat people, even enemies, even in war. He paused, emotional even after 50 years. "The Nazis tried to teach me that compassion was weakness, that mercy was betrayal, that kindness toward enemies was treason. The Americans proved that was all lies. They proved it by saving my life and treating me with dignity I didn't deserve." The interviewer asked if he felt he'd earned forgiveness for his wartime actions. Wilhelm shook his head firmly. "No, some things can't be forgiven, can't be undone. I participated in terrible things on the Eastern Front, followed orders I should have questioned, saw things I should have tried to stop. That's part of who I am, permanently." He touched his leg unconsciously. "But I've tried to be better, tried to build something good with the rest of my life, tried to honor the gift those Americans gave me by using it wisely. That's all any of us can do, acknowledge the past honestly and try to be better going forward." The story of Wilhelm Vogel is on one level a simple story of medical care during wartime. A wounded enemy soldier receives treatment, recovers, survives. It happens thousands of times in every war, the basic decency of medical personnel transcending the hatred of combat. But Wilhelm's story resonates beyond the individual case because it reveals something profound about systems, choices, and values. The difference between Wilhelm's experience and what he might have received in a German military hospital wasn't just medical. It was philosophical. The Americans had built systems grounded in the principle that every life had value. They'd trained medical personnel to treat all wounded equally. They'd allocated resources to ensure adequate supplies. They'd created protocols and procedures designed to maximize survival. And they'd fostered a culture where compassion toward enemies wasn't seen as betrayal but as expression of core values. The Nazis had built systems grounded in the opposite principle, that lives had differential value based on race, nationality, political loyalty. They'd trained personnel to prioritize Germans over others, to see enemies as less than human, to accept mass death as necessary. They'd created resource allocation systems that guaranteed shortages and rationing, and they'd fostered a culture where compassion was weakness and cruelty was strength. Wilhelm's leg, saved by penicillin, by skilled surgery, by diligent nursing care, became a physical symbol of this difference. Every step he took for the rest of his life was evidence that the democratic system's values produced better outcomes than the fascist system's values, not just morally better, though that was true, but practically better. Better medicine, better survival rates, better treatment of wounded, better outcomes. The penicillin that killed the infection in Wilhelm's leg was a product of democratic scientific research, freely shared among allies, mass-produced and distributed according to need. The Nazis had their own antibiotic research, but it had been hampered by their purge of Jewish scientists, by their ideological hostility to Jewish physics and other imagined conspiracies, by their secretiveness and competition even among supposed allies. The hospital that saved Wilhelm was staffed by people trained in institutions that valued critical thinking, individual judgment, ethical decision-making. Nazi medical training had increasingly emphasized obedience, racial theory, the subordination of individual conscience to state ideology. The American soldier who'd found Wilhelm in the snow had made a choice to help rather than ignore or kill. He'd been trained in a military culture that valued the laws of war, protection of prisoners, basic human rights. German military culture had increasingly abandoned such constraints, especially on the Eastern Front, teaching soldiers that enemies were subhuman and deserved no mercy. At every level, institutional, cultural, individual, the democratic system had produced better choices and better outcomes than the fascist system. Wilhelm's leg was the proof. In 2003, Wilhelm Vogel's grandson Thomas traveled to the United States for the first time. He was a doctor himself, working in emergency medicine in Berlin. He'd grown up hearing his grandfather's stories about the American hospital, about Dr. Morrison, about the care that had saved both a leg and a soul. Thomas's trip had a specific purpose. Through genealogical research and medical archives, he'd managed to track down Morrison's family. The doctor had died in 1987, but his daughter Rachel lived in Massachusetts. Thomas wanted to meet her, to thank her on behalf of his family for what her father had done. They met in a cafe in Boston. Rachel was 65, a retired teacher, curious about this German doctor who'd contacted her about events from nearly 60 years ago. Thomas showed her the medical records his grandfather had kept, the letters Morrison had sent, photographs of Wilhelm in his later years. "My grandfather always said your father gave him a second chance at life," Thomas explained in fluent English. "Not just physically, but morally, spiritually. He showed my grandfather that humanity was possible even in war, that decency wasn't weakness. That lesson shaped everything my grandfather became after the war." Rachel listened, moved by the story. "My father never talked much about the war," she admitted. "He found it difficult, but he always said that saving lives was the only part of war that made sense to him, the only thing that justified his presence there." She paused. "I think he would be pleased to know that his care had such a lasting impact." Thomas nodded. "It did. And not just on my grandfather. He passed those lessons forward. To my father. To me. To everyone he spoke to about his experience. Your father's kindness had a ripple effect across generations." He smiled. "I became a doctor partly because of my grandfather's stories about how medicine saved him, about how care and compassion can transform people." They talked for hours, sharing stories, connecting across the generations. Before Thomas left, Rachel gave him something, one of her father's old stethoscopes, worn but still functional. "He'd want you to have this," she said. "You're carrying forward his work, in a way. Healing people, making human connections across divisions. That's what he believed medicine was really about." Thomas carried that stethoscope back to Germany. added it to his grandfather's small collection of artifacts from the war, the medical records, the letters, photographs of Wilhelm learning to walk again, the chess set from Robert Hayes, and now Dr. Morrison's stethoscope, objects bearing testimony, evidence of a moment when humanity triumphed over ideology, when compassion proved stronger than propaganda, when simple medical care became a revolutionary act. Wilhelm Vogel's leg, saved by penicillin instead of lost to amputation, had carried him through 53 years of walking forward, of building a better life, of speaking truth about the past. That leg, that choice to save it, that system which made such choices routine rather than exceptional, all of it represented the difference between darkness and light, between death and life, between fascism and freedom. The Americans who saved Wilhelm Vogel probably never knew the full impact of their actions. They were just doing their jobs, following their training, living their values. But those routine acts of decency, multiplied across thousands of similar interactions, helped transform Germany from a genocidal regime into a democratic partner, helped create a post-war world where former enemies became friends, helped demonstrate that humanity's better angels could prevail over its darker impulses. A machine gun would have killed Wilhelm Vogel. Penicillin saved him. That simple fact contains the entire moral history of the 20th century, the choice every generation must make, between violence and healing, between hatred and compassion, between the bullet and the medicine. Wilhelm chose medicine, chose healing, chose life. And in doing so, he bore witness to the truth that would define the post-war world. We become human not through strength and domination, but through the recognition of our shared vulnerability, our common need for care, our universal capacity for kindness. His leg, scarred but functional, carried that truth forward for more than half a century. Every step he took was a testament. Every story he told was a witness. Every life he touched was another ripple spreading outward from that moment in a Belgian hospital when Dr. Morrison had said, "We're going to save your leg," and meant something far more profound than the words suggested. We're going to save your leg. We're going to save your life. We're going to save your humanity. We're going to prove that a better world is possible. One act of care at a time,